Good afternoon, everybody. It is so wonderful to be together this afternoon. I want to welcome you to this pre-launch for Lincoln in Private. We are so very glad to have this opportunity to gather together today in anticipation of this exciting book release. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Von Lower. I'm one of the pastors here at San Marino Community Church. And we here at the church are so pleased to host this event for Ron White because as a community of faith, one of our highest commitments is to the thoughtful development of people in their minds, bodies, and spirits. We work here to foster ongoing intellectual curiosity and wonder in life. And Ron and Cynthia have been wonderful comrades in this journey and have served often as partners in leading the way. So we are so grateful to have both of them as active participants here at SMCC. With the measured lifting of restrictions that's happening here in Southern California, we are able today to welcome a small gathering of people here in our fellowship hall. Today, we are also welcoming over 120 people online from across the nation. So I want to thank you, whether you are here in person or whether you are joining us online. I want to thank you for being here today because it's a joy to see your faces, for those faces that I can see, and it's a joy to share this time with you wherever you might be. Ron White is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 presidential biographies, A. Lincoln and American Ulysses. His first Lincoln book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural, was a New York Times notable book. Ron has spoken about Lincoln in England, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. Lincoln in Private will be published on May 4th, which is in 2 days' time, which means that we are not able to sell his books here today. However, particularly as we transition out of this season of pandemic, we really encourage you to visit your independent local bookstore in securing a copy of this new release, such as Vroman's Bookstore up here in Pasadena. Ron has also narrated the Random House audiobook, which is going to be available on May 4th as well. So, without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome forward Ron White to speak with us about Lincoln in Private.
Thank you, Jessica. Cynthia and I are pleased to participate in this vibrant congregation. Abraham Lincoln once said, "The better part of life consists in one's friendships." The better part of life consists in one's friendships. I want to start with some shout-outs to people who have made this book possible. Mary Evans, my literary agent for 20 years, is watching us from her farm in the Hudson Valley of New York. Mary, this is book number 5. Thank you. Caitlin McKenna is my remarkable editor at Random House. We've spent so many hours, countless conversations. She's been so important in shaping this book. I'm so grateful for Caitlin McKenna. Karen Needles is a master of finding art and photographs. She herself works at the National Archives. Thank you, Karen, for what you have done. And Nancy Mackey, with us right here, has been my partner in working on this book. And for those of you abroad, she has managed the paperless invitations to invite people from all across the country. And my in-house editor is my wife, Cynthia. Now, Cynthia knows too well that I sometimes don't remember dates in 2021, but I'm very good at dates in 1861. She often says to people that if I can't be able to deliver a speech on Abraham Lincoln, she can. It was the spring of 1863, and Abraham Lincoln faced a chorus of critics after 2 terrible years of war. While Union and Confederate forces fought, the Northern public was becoming increasingly restless. In the North, with a larger army and a greater industrial might, people expected the North to win this war in 3, if not 6 months. Within the North, a movement began that be very critical of Lincoln. It was a movement to restore as it was the Union as it was. That was the Union with slavery. Forget the whole idea of emancipation. A faction of the Democratic Party, known as Copperheads, fulminated against Lincoln, charging that he was a tyrannical despot and that the war was a means to enlarge federal power. Where have we heard that before? That spring, rallies in northern cities protested Lincoln's handling of the arrest and trial of Clement Van Landingham, an Ohio Copperhead politician. In Albany, New York, they put together a group of what they called the Albany Resolves, and they sent them to Lincoln in protest. Lincoln readied himself to write a response to the Albany Resolves. As he sat in his office, ready to write this letter, a congressman from Iowa, James Wilson, entered. He watched Lincoln writing, and he said to him, "This is remarkable that you can just simply sit and write a letter, scratch." Oh, he said, "Oh, no." He said, "Look at the drawer. It's all in there. All my notes. They've been there all the time." So for Lincoln, he told Wilson, "I never let one of those ideas escape me." But over the years, with 16,000 Lincoln books, those ideas have escaped us. We know very much about the public Lincoln, the Lincoln who leads the nation to save the Union in the Civil War, the Lincoln of the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural Address, but we know very little of the private Lincoln. Lincoln's law partner in Springfield, William Herndon, said, "He is the most shut-mouthed man I've ever met." We think of Lincoln as this great public figure, but actually he was a very, very private person. What Lincoln did do, and what is the purpose of this book, is from time to time to take little slips of paper and to write out his thoughts, his ideas, his struggles, his debate with himself. Now, he never dated them, he never titled them, and he never signed them because he never thought we would ever see them. But when, sadly, he was assassinated in April of 1865, Lincoln's friend, who was a justice of the Supreme Court, Douglas, asked the two young secretaries, Hay and Nicolay, if they would gather up Lincoln's papers, put them together, and send them back to Illinois, where Davis lived. As they gathered all those papers together, they found these notes. And in the publication, Hay and Nicolay wrote a biography of Lincoln. Then they wrote a collected works of Lincoln. These notes appear. They often called them fragments because they were fragmentary. You will see if you look at some of the notes that some of them begin in the middle of a word. They end before the sentence ends. They end with a comma. It's like you or I was sitting here writing something and the telephone rang, or somebody knocked at the door, and so you have to step away from the note. I was very privileged to work with the new Abraham Lincoln Papers Project in Springfield, Illinois, and I asked them, how many notes do you have that you believe are authentic Lincoln notes? We came up with a number of 111. And again, with credit to my editor, Caitlin McKenna, she said, we need to publish for the first time ever all 111 of those notes in the appendix to the book. You see Lincoln drawing charts, doing all sorts of things as he thinks out loud. Let's refresh our mind a little bit about the biography of Lincoln. Born in 1809, he lived with his family in Kentucky before they moved to southern Indiana. He then, at a young age of 21, moved with his family to Illinois and to the small, tiny village of New Salem. So we only have one note from the 1830s. I think he wrote more. But if you're a young person, you're living in New Salem, you're sleeping in the back room of a store, or as a single man, you board with various families for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, that's not exactly conducive to keeping these notes. So we have 7 notes from the 1840s as Lincoln begins to move forward in his life and his career. Suddenly, in the 1850s, when his political career takes flight, we have all kinds of notes, and these notes will continue literally to the last day of his life in 1865. I think he must have written hundreds of these notes. We have 111 of them. I've decided in 10 chapters to look at different facets of Lincoln using 12 of these notes to show that with his very nimble mind, he could do so many different kinds of writing. Early on, when he grew up in what we call the Second Great Awakening. His family were members of the Baptist churches in both Kentucky and Indiana. Lincoln rebelled against this kind of religion. He found it far too emotional. He, at age 9 or 10, would come out after church and mimic the pastor, saying the words right after him from memory until his father hit him on the backside and told him to get home. So from that time forward, Lincoln decided he was not going to be a person of emotion. He would be a person of reason and logic. And so most of the notes are very logical, very reasonable, but not all of them. The wonderful first note that I have in this book is his trip in 1848 to Niagara Falls, in which he is overcome by the beauty and the wonder of Niagara Falls. And he writes about it in the most lyrical, almost poetic way. So these notes reflect a whole variety of Lincoln, his nimble mind. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk about 3 of these notes, 3 of the 12 that I've written about, and then open the conversation up for your comments and questions. The first note that I want to talk about is his, and we'll now use my clicker here. I think. There we go. This is his so-called notes for a lecture to lawyers. Lincoln spent 24 years of his life as a lawyer, only 14 years as an elected politician. And yet most often in the biographies of Lincoln, that 24 years as a lawyer gets short shrift. I tried to include more of this in my biography, but my earlier editor, David Ebersoff, came back to me and said, Ron, this isn't very sexy. I have to say that how many lawyers are here in the room. About 30 years ago, a Lincoln Legal Project began in Springfield, Illinois. And the question was asked, well, if Lincoln practiced law, let's investigate the 102 county courthouses in Illinois and see if we can find any Lincoln documents. They sent out a whole bunch of master's students from the University of Illinois at Springfield, and they found hundreds and hundreds of Lincoln legal documents. Many of them had turned blue with age, and almost every one, his name had been razor-bladed out by someone in the 19th century. In the 19th century, people didn't want you to sign their book, they wanted you to sign your autograph book. I remember some years ago, I was speaking at the Free Library in Philadelphia, and a very elderly woman came up to me and she said, I don't want you to sign my book. She thrust out her autograph book and she said, just sign my autograph book. But we know those are Lincoln legal documents by his very distinctive handwriting. So let's look at this thing. I'm going to have to read it to you probably because it's very hard to see it completely. But I wanted you to see the fragment. And another beautiful part of this book is that, again, through my editor, she persuaded Random House, this is not inexpensive, to have 16 pages of fragments printed in color, so you can get the actual shape and texture of the fragment. Lincoln begins this fragment, I am not an accomplished lawyer. I find quite as much material for a lecture in those points where I have failed as in those where I have been moderately successful. Can you imagine a modern leader of any sort, political, business, academic, beginning by saying, I am not, and Lincoln goes on to say, I find quite as much material for a lecture in those points where I have failed as in those where I have been moderately successful. Let's pick up Lincoln's biography. He does serve 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature. He runs and succeeds in being elected to a single term in Congress. 1847 to 1849. But this was the time of the war with Mexico. And Lincoln, one of the youngest members of Congress, right at the beginning, Congress then began on the first Monday of December. It really was a civilian Congress. It only met in the wintertime because everybody else had to go home to tend to their farms or tend to their shops. So it usually only met for 3 or 4 months a year. So already in December, Lincoln challenges President James Polk over the war with Mexico. And he says to Polk, "You show me the spot where the Mexicans invaded the United States. I am quite convinced that it's exactly the opposite. The United States started this war with Mexico." And then he says to Polk, "You sit where Washington sat, and I ask you to speak the truth." Well, Lincoln went home and was told, "Thank you very much, Mr. Lincoln. You will not be elected to a second term. We do not appreciate the fact that you are challenging the President of the United States. Even though we may agree with you, we think this is pretty headstrong on your part." So in 1849, Lincoln returns and takes up the practice of law. And what he does is he travels what's called the 8th Judicial Circuit. This is a portion of central Illinois that is twice as large as the state of Connecticut. And he traveled by buggy or by horse. He went out twice a year, 3 months each time. My good friend Guy Fraker, lawyer in Bloomington, Illinois, one day not too long ago took a bunch of us on a bus tour where we went across that 8th Judicial Circuit. And here Lincoln learns what it means to be a lawyer. So although the date in the collected works of Lincoln is that he wrote this Notes for a Lecture to Lawyers in 1850, I don't believe that's the right date. I think he wouldn't possibly have had the audacity to do that when he just returned to being a lawyer. I think it should be a later date where he has more experience. And why did he offer the lecture? Well, the way one became a lawyer in those days was that you studied with another lawyer. You were a clerk in that law office. Lincoln reversed that pattern. Most people were lawyers and then became politicians. Lincoln was a politician who became a lawyer. And being a lawyer really was as much judging your moral character. And so Lincoln became a lawyer. But then as his reputation grew, people wanted to come and study with him. But he couldn't do that because he was out on the 8th Judicial Circuit 175, 180, 185 days a year until the railroads came and allowed him to come back into Springfield. So I think that's the reason that he decided to offer this lecture to lawyers. The leading rule for the lawyer, as for the man of every other calling, is diligence. Leave nothing for tomorrow which can be done today. Never let your correspondence fall behind. Whatever piece of business you have in hand, before stopping, do all the labor pertaining to it, which can then be done. Lincoln has a particular attitude towards the law. There was a saying in Illinois, everyone is going to law. In a frontier society, people were suing each other as much as possible. They were suing over land. They were suing over over slander. But Lincoln had learned from his second law partner that the better part of being a lawyer is to not bring suits to court, but to actually allow people to settle their differences outside of court. Discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often the real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. I love that sentence. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. There will still be business enough. There's only 2 courthouses still standing in Illinois from the time that Lincoln practiced law. If you get to central Illinois, Skip, I think you want to do that, you need to go to the Metamora Courthouse. If you go there, the local historian will tell you a wonderful Lincoln story. I think it may be true, but it's a good story. The story is that Lincoln is defending a woman. Her husband had attacked her violently, and she picked up a piece of wood, hit him in the head, and killed him. So now she is being accused of murder. So Lincoln is defending this woman, and in the middle of the day, they take a break, and when they come back into the courtroom, the judge says to Lincoln, "Well, where is your client?" "Well," he said, "Judge, during lunchtime, she asked me where could she get a drink of water, and I told her Tennessee." And then the suit was dismissed. What I find fascinating in this fragment on the Notes for a Law lecture is that although in one sense it's intended for aspiring lawyers, but actually amidst all the legal documents that have been accumulated in this huge Lincoln legal project, this is really for me a self-portrait of Lincoln. What kind of a person he is. And I think it's a real key to who he will become as a peacemaker. Now, Lincoln became a great war president. He taught himself what it meant to be commander-in-chief. He checked books out of the Library of Congress, but he was looking forward to the second term because he felt his better skills were being a peacemaker, being a reconciler, leading the nation through Reconstruction. That's what he looked forward to doing. So I love this fragment, Lincoln's Notes for a Law lecture. Did I get this? Here we go, I'll get it. This is a very distinctive fragment, I believe. It's one of many that Lincoln brings to talk about slavery. "We were thunderstruck and stunned, and we reeled and fell in utter confusion, but we rose each fighting, grasping whatever he could first reach, a scythe, a pitchfork, a chopping axe, or a butcher's cleaver. We struck in the direction of the sound, and we are rapidly closing in upon him." Lincoln enters the fray, leaving his law practice mostly in 1854, because the Kansas-Nebraska Act has been passed, led by the Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. And this act will now give permission, as we go west into the territories, Nebraska, Kansas, much larger than they are today, that people will have the right to vote whether they want slavery or not. Stephen Douglas called this popular sovereignty. He said, "This is a democratic principle." And as Douglas came back to advance this all across Illinois, step by step by step, Lincoln would show up. And then at the end of Douglas's speech, the crowd would call out, "Lincoln, Lincoln, Lincoln." And after dinner, Lincoln would return and answer Douglas. And this is what he said in his very first speech. "The doctrine of self-government is right, absolutely and internally right, but it has no application, as here attempted. Why? Such a just application depends upon whether the Negro is not or is a man." He went on to say, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution." This fragment alone does not exist in Springfield. Springfield digitized all the fragments, including all the notes of Lincoln that are at the Huntington Library. But this fragment, fortunately for me, is in a home of a person I've come to know in Dallas, Texas. He has the most amazing private library with his own full-time curator. And he has given me permission to use this fragment, which he believes is the jewel of his entire collection of Washington, Jefferson, and going forward. And so here we have it. You may struggle to read it. Let me try to read it for you. July 1st, 1854 is what the editors suggest is the date. That really is roughly when Lincoln re-enters politics on the basis of his response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. "If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color, then, the lighter, having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. Oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superior to blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be the slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But you say it's a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. We are listening to a man with barely 1 year of formal education. Boys in Kentucky and Indiana only received education in January and February when it was too cold to be working in the fields alongside their father. And so family hired kind of traveling teachers. And we think Lincoln spent 5, maybe 6 January, February years growing up. This was his education. But his education was continuing. He took Euclid with him when he was 40 years of age out on the 8th Judicial Circuit. He read Euclid to strengthen his logical, rational ability. At age 23, he purchased a grammar book. What a grammar book. It said in the preface that it was for adolescents. Oh, I'd love adolescents to read it today. Half of the book was titled Declamation. Well, that's not a word we use today. What is declamation? Declamation means the last half of the grammar book was you were to practice the words out loud from the Bible, from Lord Byron, from Shakespeare, and on and on and on. The gift of public speaking. Didn't even get a chance to read in his notes to lawyers that Lincoln says public speaking is the key to being a good lawyer. People will respond to you and come to you if they understand that you are a good public speaker. We sometimes make the mistake when we talk of extemporaneous speaking. Extemporaneous speaking doesn't mean you just get up and talk whatever's on the top of your head. No, Lincoln would say extemporaneous speaking is because you've developed a whole well of knowledge and experience from what you can speak. Did Lincoln use these fragments in his speeches? Were they perhaps just first drafts of something that he would say? Well, he spoke many, many, many times on slavery. In fact, at the end of 1854, he gave a speech. You ready for this? 17,000 words. 17,000 words. And you're all sitting here tonight. Everybody was standing. Everybody was standing. They all stood for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those debates were 3.5 hours. They got there early, and they all stood. Maybe 15, 20, maybe 50 chairs were there, but everybody else stood. This was an oral culture where people were involved in issues, and Lincoln was at home in this oral culture. He was a great writer. He was a great speaker. So in reading this particular fragment, what is Lincoln doing here? He's really taking on the proponents of slavery, Stephen Douglas and others, and he's using logic. I imagine him almost like a courtroom lawyer who's kind of marching along in the courtroom, sort of saying, very well, all right, yes, answering piece by piece by piece. One of the fragments, 2 of the fragments actually that I'm not able to speak about tonight, concern that Lincoln's reading habits. Lots of the Lincoln scholars and biographers say that Lincoln read mostly newspapers, and he did read newspapers, but he also read books. His partner, William Herndon, wanted Lincoln to read some anti-slavery newspapers, so he subscribed to them. People would make subscriptions to the great newspapers of the day. And then Lincoln said to Herndon, well, now we need to also subscribe to 2 of the leading Southern newspapers. Well, why would you want to do that? We need to subscribe to the Richmond paper and the Charleston Courier because he told Herndon we need to have both sides at the table. We need to have both sides at the table. So one of the books in this Presbyterian church was written by Frederick Ross in 1857. a defense of slavery. Frost was a Presbyterian minister. He had given these speeches at the Presbyterian General Assembly, and he attempted to argue from the Bible that slavery was the will of God. So Lincoln, he never mentions this book in any of his speeches. He reads Frederick Ross's speech, and then he offers his own fragment response to it. And at the end, he is so angry about this that his sentences just have triple exclamation points, triple exclamation point, triple exclamation points. He reads 2 pro-slavery books so that he's aware of what the other side is doing. I think this is part of his training as a lawyer, because his second partner said, you need to understand, not simply intellectually, but emotionally, experientially, what is the argument of the other side. Until you can enter into the argument of the other side, you will never be able to be an able lawyer or politician. Oh, how we need that judgment today to try to enter into the argument or judgment of the other side. In my writings of biography, I've tried to write from what I call from the inside out. I'm interested in what a person does, but I'm interested in the formation of that person, the formation of their ideas. I also have come to believe that the faith stories of our American leaders have mostly, recently especially, been underplayed, if not denied. And so the last fragment in the book is Lincoln's meditation on the divine will. Now, I said that Lincoln didn't title them. Why am I therefore giving this a title? When I first started thinking about Lincoln, I was teaching a class on Lincoln at UCLA in the history department. The Huntington Library, some of you may remember this, put on this incredible exhibit on Lincoln. And I would take my students over from UCLA to the Huntington to listen to see the exhibit. And then I would find someone there to give a lecture on Lincoln. It wouldn't be me, but I found Paul Zahl to give lectures on Lincoln. And I began to ask myself, well, there's got to be an antecedent to the second inaugural address. In 701 words in that address, Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, invokes prayer 3 times. What is the antecedent to that? Suddenly, this person who many view as not religious at all, he never formally joined a church. So I learned and heard that there was a fragment called the Meditation on the Divine Will at Brown University. Why at Brown? Well, John Hay, Lincoln's young secretary, found it in Lincoln's drawer after his death. Hay was a graduate of Brown, and that's why it exists there. If you look carefully, it's hard to quite see it. It's on blue-lined paper. I don't think they'd let me hold it today, but way back then, the Mary Jo Klein, I remember her name, the curator, let me hold that piece of paper in my hands. And I just couldn't quite believe this incredible meditation. The story of when it's written, there are different accounts of it. I believe the story is that in September of 1862, the North had lost yet another battle. This was the second Battle of Bull Run, or the second Battle of Manassas. Lincoln convened an emergency cabinet meeting to decide what to do. Fortunately, in those days, 3 members of the cabinet kept very intricate diaries. And one of the members of the cabinet, Edward Bates, Attorney General from Missouri, wrote in his diary, Lincoln was so upset this day, he said he felt almost like hanging himself. He felt almost like hanging himself. Then he went and, I think that afternoon, sat down and wrote this amazing meditation. When Hay found it, he gave it the title, Meditation on the Divine Will. It's untitled by Lincoln. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and in the book you will see Lincoln has a habit of underlining words. He does this in his public speeches, but he does this in his notes. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. The logical Lincoln is speaking. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I am almost ready to say, this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. This is the antecedent of the second inaugural address. When Lincoln delivered the address in March 4th, 1865, no one knew of this meditation. So no one knew that he had been thinking about this for 2.5 years before he uttered the address. Let me make just a couple of comments on it. I think this, what I'm suggesting in my whole book is, does the private Lincoln allow us to see aspects of Lincoln that perhaps we've not seen before, not seen in the traditional biographies, not seen in the public Lincoln? And I think again and again the answer is yes. And I think this fragment answers the question of Lincoln's religious odyssey, his faith pilgrimage. The will of God prevails. Lincoln had grown up with his aversion to that second Great Awakening Baptist religion. And so he did what many of your children or grandchildren have done. He rejected the Christian faith. And when he moved to New Salem, when they began to put him forward as a young politician, he wrote a paper criticizing the Bible and criticizing Christianity. And one of his friends, and we have several independent testimonies, took it out of his hand and threw it into the fire. This is not something that you should do in the 1830s if you want to run for political office, is criticize Christianity. But then, as it is for all of us, life tumbles in. In 1850, it tumbled in first when Eddie, age 3.5, died. And Lincoln, looking around for someone to conduct the funeral service, wanted to turn to Charles Dresser, the Episcopal priest who had married he and Mary, but he was out of town, and so he turned to the new young Presbyterian minister, Smith. He conducted the funeral. When Lincoln comes to Washington, he's looking around perhaps to join various churches. He's, I think, drawn to the Presbyterian Church because this tradition of Christianity offers a thoughtful, reflective, rational approach. I think the missing person in the Lincoln story is Phineas Densmore Gurley, number one in his class at Princeton Seminary, who offered the kind of thoughtful preaching to which Lincoln could respond. But then life tumbles in again, and Willie, age 11, dies in 1862. Mary will never quite overcome that. She literally wears black the rest of her life. This boy dies in the White House. She can't abide by it. Lincoln asked Gurley to preach the funeral sermon. We have the funeral sermon. And as Gurley preaches, he leans, I think, forward. I can see him doing this to Lincoln. He says, I ask you to trust in biblical providence. Biblical providence. So Lincoln has moved from aversion to the Christian faith, then to what he calls fatalism, kind of the doctrine of necessity, what we might call the original deism. But now this fragment and his second inaugural is all filled with providence. For that's what he heard Gurley preaching at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. I love this one sentence. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. The balance between God's activity and human activity. And then this next sentence I've puzzled over a long time. I'm not quite sure how Lincoln might have said it. There's two ways to say it. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true that God wills this contest. But maybe he said it this way. I am almost ready to say this is probably true. Some have accused Lincoln of saying, well, he knows exactly what God is about to do. No, he doesn't at all. He's affirming God's purpose in the world, but far be it from him in his own humility to say, and I know exactly what it is. He was so tired of ministers and politicians who were coming to him day after day to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. He knew they were coming to Jefferson Davis and saying, God is on our side, God is on our side. So, there's much more to talk about. In my epilogue, I make the comment that I have a great joy in speaking to high schoolers. I've had the privilege of speaking to high schools all across this country. From the Governor's Academy in Massachusetts, founded in 1763, the oldest continuing boarding school in America, to the great Punahou School in Honolulu, the school that Barack Obama attended. And I like to ask the students who are all studying in 11th grade, they're studying American history, I say, now how long do you think it took Lincoln to write these notes? The faculty are all standing in the back, and the students will say something like, well, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And I say, how about an hour or 2 hours? I did this at Poly High School in Pasadena, and the faculty are going back there like, and I make the comment, whether I should or shouldn't, that our addiction to screens today, the addiction of young people to their screens, makes it very difficult to take the time to contemplate, to think as Lincoln does. These are not something that he just jots down. I imagine him sitting there thinking for a long time about all of the remarkable thinking that goes into these fragments. So Lincoln in private, we know a lot about the public Lincoln. I'm suggesting that these fragments, and the appendix has all 111 of the fragments, offers up a new window to appreciate this person. Now, I know that Lincoln cannot solve climate change. I know that he can't advise President Biden on what to do in Afghanistan. But I do believe that he's one of those very few transformative figures in American history that somehow does speak across time, that his spirit, that he's bidding us to respect each other, to be involved in the life of the mind. This is something that I think Lincoln can still speak to in 2021. Thank you.
We have an opportunity to share comments and ask questions of Ron White. And so I just want to give you a few instructions on how that's going to go, both in the room and online. For those of you who have comments in the room, I invite you to just raise your hand. Please let me come to you and let me hold the mic for you. You do not need to remove your mask. We will be able to hear you through it. And if for some reason there needs to be clarification, I'm happy to help offer that clarification for the room. If you are with us online, then you hopefully have gotten some instructions from Skip today, but I'm just going to revisit them. I'm getting the thumbs up from Skip, yeah. So if you would like to ask a question, then just please click on the raise hand button. You're going to find that at the bottom of your screen. When you are recognized, please turn on your camera if it's not already on. And then Skip will unmute you and get you on the screen so that Dr. White and everybody here in the room will be able to see and hear you. You then can ask your question. We also want to make the note that if you're a little too shy to be on camera, you are always welcome to use the question and answer function that is down at the bottom of your screen near that raise hand button. We just want to let you know that we will be taking those live questions first. So, with that said, if you have a question in the room, please feel free to raise your hand. And if you have a question online, please feel free to click the raise your hand button.
Ron, you mentioned in the introduction that the notes were not dated, yet during your presentation you did talk about dates. How were you able to do that?
Thank you, John. The dates are really offered by the editors. Hay and Nicolay published the Papers of Abraham Lincoln in 1905. Roy Basler and team published another newer version in the 1950s. Often the date is followed by a question mark. And that often there'll be a footnote where the editor says, well, we think because of this, that, and the other. And often we don't know when the date was. For example, in 1875, Mary Lincoln, after a lot of trauma, was in a courtroom assigned to an insane asylum for female patients, a very traumatic event. She's there for about 6 weeks, and Eliza Bradwell, one of the first women lawyers, campaigns to get Mary out. And she's successful, and Mary is released from the insane asylum. And in response, Mary gives her one of the notes of Abraham Lincoln. There's no date to it, but she gives it to her. And this is one of the most phenomenal notes. It's one of the chapters. So we're not sure often what is the note. Sometimes Lincoln writes a note where he says, 22 years ago, Judge Douglas, Stephen Douglas, and I met. So we can figure, okay, 22 years ago, we know when they met. So sometimes there's some markers within the note itself. But often this is really the editor suggesting. And you remember, I sort of suggested that I think the Notes for a Lawyer probably was not written in 1850. That's just my surmise. I don't think Lincoln would give a lecture within months after returning home from being a congressman.
We have Richard Fox.
Oh.
Go ahead and unmute. There he is.
Hello, Richard. Richard is professor at USC, my compatriot in crime.
Yes. Ron and I have known each other for a decade and a half and have often talked about the meditation on divine will. I've had Ron come to my classes and talk about it, and I'm just thrilled that you introduced it here today too for this audience. Ron, is there any other fragment that you've come across either among the 12 that you were writing about in the book or in the entire 111? Is there any other fragment that actually more or less reproduces, or rather is more or less later reproduced in its language in some public statement that Lincoln makes? In the case of the meditation, it's the second inaugural, as you point out, and you know, we've talked about this many times, how you can actually find the language of the meditation in the second inaugural. Is that a unique case, or is there any other case where you pick up the actual language of a fragment in some later public statement?
There are a few, Richard, in response to your question, where Lincoln is kind of preparing himself to give a speech. But what strikes me the most is that some of the most interesting ones, he never uses them in the public speeches. Why? I think they're just his own intellectual kind of grist of thinking through this. Why he doesn't, that's impossible to answer, but I think that's his choice. This is about the only one where you have this explicit meditation on the divine will, religious language, except when he's criticizing the two pro-slavery books and becomes furious about their arguments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Dr. White, who are Lincoln's contemporaries that he looked up to the most?
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Dean, Lincoln looked up to Henry Clay, not exactly a contemporary, older than he. Clay ran for the presidency 3 times. And one time, and this is very insightful, he lost the presidency because in the state of New York, the Liberty Party, which would have been the left-leaning party of that day, received 15,000 votes. And it cost Clay the state of New York. Without the Liberty Party, he would have won New York, and he would have won the presidency, one of the greatest politicians of our time. And what Lincoln called those people was the righteous. He said, I am heartily angry at the righteous who decide that they're going to obliterate this great man because they are going to vote 15,000 people. Interesting, again, for today, Henry Clay's greatest name was the Great Compromiser. The Great Compromiser. He was a Whig. The Whigs were the predecessor of the Republican Party. If you visit his home today, you will see all of that there in Kentucky. And he was a man who, although he was a Southerner, he was also, and this is the irony that we can't seem to understand today when we discuss these things, he was against slavery, even though, in a sense, he and his fellows owned slaves. So when Lincoln travels to Washington to become a congressman in the fall of 1847, he stops in Mary's hometown, Lexington. Her father, who's a leading citizen of the town, has arranged a meeting with Henry Clay speaking, and Lincoln attends. And Clay blasts the South, and he's a Southerner, because he said they want to go into this war with Mexico so they can expand into Mexico and expand slavery into Mexico. And I think that really gives the foundation of Lincoln then arriving and taking on James Polk. So I would say, and Lincoln at Clay's death calls him, he's my beau ideal of a statesman. On the NewsHour, if you watched it on Friday evening, David Brooks trotted out, he didn't use the name of Henry Clay, but he said the great system, this was David Brooks, was the American system. This was really the Republican Party coming into being. What was the American system? It was internal improvements, canals, ultimately railroads. It was a sound banking system. And so Brooks is arguing that these really should be the bulwark of the Republican Party today because they were the foundation of the Republican Party under Henry Clay.
Dr. White, we have Donald K. McKim joining us.
Oh, Don.
He's coming on board. You want to unmute yourself? He's coming up. While we're waiting, I have a shout out from David Kent, who said, superb presentation, Ron. Looking forward to your speaking on the Lincoln Group of DC later this year. So, here it comes. That'll you'll need to unmute and turn on your camera. We can hear you.
Okay.
Hello, Don. You're speaking to us from Nashville?
Memphis. Yeah, we're in Memphis.
Oh, Memphis, right. I got it wrong. Yes.
There
you are.
The book. A little bit along the lines of Richard Fox in terms of Lincoln and Providence and the will of God and so on. And you talk about Phineas Gurley in your A. Lincoln book. I wondered if he ever went into this topic on a more personal level and would have maybe used some kinds of these notes to help him work through issues like this, presenting one side and another, or were these more after he had kind of made up his mind and wanted to present an argument? After the death of his son there in the White House, would have been a time perhaps when he might have done this with a note that would be more introspective on a personal level in relation to Providence. But I just wondered if anything like that is uncovered, or if he uses these to help him work through different intellectual questions.
Thank you, Don. A shout out to Don. People sometimes say to me, oh, Dr. White, you're a theologian. I say, no, I'm an historian. Don is a theologian, and when I came to trying to understand the meditation on the divine will and a particular phrase, I turned to Don, and Don was the one who said, Ron, that's part of the Westminster Confession of Faith. That's where Lincoln gets those words. And that helped me argue this is not simply, as a lot of historians say, oh, Lincoln is just doffing his hat to religion. No, this is a very sophisticated theological document, and Don McKim, a wonderful Presbyterian theologian, helped me see that. In answer to your question, it's probably both. I think Lincoln likes to think this way. One of the things I find about his mind is that he wants to genuinely enter into the other side. He always wants to consider at least two sides. In the thing on slavery, it's three sides. This is the way he thinks. I think it's part of his law training. It's part of his respect for the other side. But then he will, I think often when he gets to a speech, it may be a little more direct. It may be more experiential. This is kind of the scaffolding. This is kind of the foundation. But it doesn't necessarily translate into the public speech that he will give months or years later. He does save these. This caught me by surprise too. In his presidency, he wants to send a note to Pennsylvania, which is a very important state for the Republican cause, and so he digs out a note he wrote in 1849, and he sends it to someone in 1862. He said, I think I wrote this in 1849, but it might be helpful to you now. So he did save some of these notes as much as he could. Don, wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Yes, Ron,
Yes.
with your vast knowledge of Lincoln over decades, what has going through these notes added to your idea of who Lincoln was?
Thank you, Nancy, for that question. What did in my years of living with Lincoln, I feel like I am living with him. I hope that's all right with Cynthia, but I am living with him. I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I have to have a pad by my bed to kind of write down something. Nancy's question is, what did it learn for me in doing this? I always knew that Lincoln was thoughtful, was brilliant. I had studied his speeches. But I had never really entered into this. When I traveled to Brown University to look at that one fragment, the Meditation on the Divine Will, I had no idea there are 110 other fragments. And so the exercise of writing this book pushed me and forced me to look at numbers of fragments that I'd never encountered before. And so I found here a greater appreciation of the intellectual curiosity. I think that's a key quality of leadership. Intellectual curiosity. Lincoln is an intellectually curious person, and he is a lifelong learner. His education didn't stop at 22 or 25 or 30 or 35 or 40. He is still learning, and I think these notes tell us this story. So this is a story that I think we haven't fully appreciated.
Ron, we have Hugh Ralston with us.
Oh,
I'm promoting Ron, or to Hugh, and while we're waiting, there's a note from Robert McLennan who says, Ron, so good to see you. All the best on the launch. Jane and I are here to listen, so they're here listening away, along with lots of other folks. Here's Hugh.
Hi, Ron. Greetings from Lincoln's home in Kentucky. I was a little worried at the last question that someone had taken my my query. Your book clearly dives deeper into a story that continues to fascinate because of the depths of Lincoln and his approach, and continues to move away from sort of the cartoon version of Lincoln that we were maybe brought up. My question to you is was there anything in these fragments that surprised you that didn't just deepen your knowledge of Lincoln as a leader or as a man, but that really surprised you, someone who spent a lot of years studying Lincoln and as an authority on Lincoln, either in terms of perspectives that he had or insights that thought, well, wait a minute, this is a different spin on Lincoln than we might have learned before, not necessarily the celebrity salacious gossip that's going to be the lead part of the review of your book, but was there just something that you thought was really something that surprised you?
thank you, Hugh. Good to hear your question and to see you. Yes, I've written a biography of Lincoln, so I've taken a lot of time to try to understand him. Let me read you one fragment that really, I think, captures something that I didn't fully appreciate. 22 years ago, Judge Douglas and I first became acquainted. The editor suggests December 1856, ? We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then, we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. I have to preface this by saying that the previous year, Lincoln had run for the United States Senate. Until the early 20th century, that run for Senate was decided by state legislatures. Lincoln led on the first 7 ballots, but he couldn't quite get to the top. And the debate, or the political contest, really developed around this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so Lincoln was faced with a very difficult problem. There was a Democrat running, but who was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Lincoln's advisor said, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. And he said, no, if I keep fighting, a Republican will win who's for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I will step back, and I will let the Democrat win the election because he's against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he is anti-slavery. Well, Lincoln was very magnanimous afterwards. Oh, it's okay, you know, I lost the election, but I'm all right, don't worry about me, everything's fine. Then he writes this fragment. Even then we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. With him, it has been one of splendid success. His name fills the nation and is not unknown even in foreign lands. I affect no contempt for the high eminence he has reached. I often think that as Lincoln is writing this note, maybe you've had the same experience, he writes something and then he says, oh my goodness, I don't really want to leave it there. I think I've got to balance this out. So reached that the oppressed of my species might have shared with me in the elevation. I would rather stand on that eminence than wear the richest crown that ever pressed a monarch's brow. So what surprised me in the fragments was Lincoln's willingness to express his feelings. He did not express his feelings in public. That was not part of the 19th century. That was not part of his DNA. But here, he never thought we'd see this. He expresses his feelings and that he's a failure. In less than 4 years, he'll be elected president of the United States. That was a real learning for me.
Dr. White, we have Stephen Davis. All right. I'm gonna come on in, Stephen, and turn on your camera.
This is amazing.
Technology is fun.
We were supposed to, 15 months ago, we planned a book launch at the National Press Club in Washington, which is where we held the launch for American Ulysses, hosted by the Trinity Forum. And we had 200 people that night. Now we got people from all over the country, and you're here for the first time in person, and we've got members of the church able to watch it. Okay, are we ready?
Ron, can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, here you are. Thank you.
All right.
Steve.
Ron, it was a delight to hear your presentation this afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book, as I read, I think, most of your others, not all of them, but this is something I'm really anticipating. Nobody can predict the future very accurately, but I want to ask you a little bit about your anticipated reception, the anticipated reception of this book by the scholarly community. And what I'm thinking here is mainly on the issue of Lincoln's religiosity. I've always thought of Abraham Lincoln as a man who went through many religious changes during his life, of course, as you mentioned today, but as somebody who, especially the mature Lincoln, was a very spiritual person who knew Scripture obviously very well, quoted Scripture a lot, definitely believed in divine providence. Okay, now we live in a time when historians and very many academics these days, and people in the media and journalism and in other places are really getting more and more secular. And some of them, I'll even say, historians want to draw a red line through religion and act like it didn't have any influence or something of that sort. I'm just wondering whether you anticipate any reaction against some of the things you are seeing in these fragments from Lincoln as far as his religiosity is concerned.
Thank you, Steve. Stephen Davis is professor of philosophy at Claremont McKenna College, retired, wonderful friend. Well, Steve, when I wrote my first book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, I was told, the Associated Press reviewed it, and they said, well, what would you expect for someone who's teaching at a Presbyterian theological seminary? What would you expect? So you're absolutely correct. There is this crescendo almost to deny the role of religion, to suggest that this was something that people in the 19th century did, that Lincoln read the Bible just like people read Shakespeare. Don't make too much out of it. I'm sure, as my friend Richard Fox has kidded me, that people talk behind my back, because I'm suggesting that Lincoln is not simply aware of the power of religion, of the influence of religion, which has been suggested, but that he's on, as you suggest, his own personal journey. And what's remarkable to me, Steve, is that we have allowed Lincoln to be on a journey in many areas of his life. So it is true that he early on was a fan and really a proponent of the American Colonization Society, all the way up into the first part of his presidency. That society was that we could not live black and white together in America, and that African Americans would be better going to Africa. And so Lincoln has been tagged with that. Recently, in this whole movement to tear down statues, the Freedmen's Memorial, dedicated in 1876 in Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass gives the speech, and he says early in the speech, Lincoln was the white man's president. And when you read all the articles about the speeches, that's all you read. But in the latter part of the speech, Douglass says, but as for this white man, he was fast, he was speedy, he was quick, more than any other leader. And so we have to see that balance. So what I'm arguing is, can we give credit for Lincoln changing, as you suggest, for Lincoln growing, for him responding to the experiences in his life, the death of his two sons, the crucible of the Civil War, and that's the only way I think we can understand the second inaugural. It shocked people when suddenly Lincoln starts quoting Scripture. There'd only been one quotation of Scripture in the entire 18 previous inaugural addresses, and Lincoln quotes Scripture 4 times. I think this is extremely genuine. It isn't decorative. It's foundational to his argument. But I'm sure you're correct. There will be people who do not want to hear this, and sadly, it's within the academic community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Ron, what criterion did you use to select the 12 fragments you wrote about and not the others?
Tom, that's a very good question. It was a tough decision. First of all, I didn't want to write a 700-page book. And first I thought, well, we'll have 10 fragments, but the reason that there's 12 is that the chapter on slavery, there's 2 on slavery, and the chapter on the birth of the Republican Party, there's 2 on the birth of the Republican Party. So I could have chosen more. I was asked to, this is a wonderful surprise to me that they have allowed me to be the narrator on the audiobook. And so the director said, well, we can't let you speak all 111 fragments. Would you choose 5 more? So I chose 5 additional ones, which are on the audiobook. So now we have 17. So there's a lot more that I could have chosen. It was more kind of space and time, not wanting to make this book too long. But difficult decisions, because there's a number of them that are really so compelling and so interesting. Thank you.
Dr. Wright, we have one more call-in from Bill Quigley.
Oh, Bill.
And here he comes. Lots of other written questions, so we may have to have you stay around and talk to me for a few minutes, but here he comes.
Hi, Ron.
Hello, Bill. Bill, in Maine. I'm coming to Maine this summer to finish my biography of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and to see you.
I look forward to it very much. My question, Ron, is The Republican Party today, of course, it claims Lincoln as its founder, the party of Lincoln. Many Democrats would say that, well, the party has really changed so much that they're not so sure that's true. And as a Lincoln scholar, I think what I hear you saying is that Lincoln is really not fully understood. And that if we were to really understand him, maybe we would better understand the situation we're in. So my question to you is, what would Lincoln do today?
Oh, now you're going to get me into trouble. Everett Dirksen in 1954, the great Illinois senator, said it's the task of every politician to get right with Lincoln, to get right with Lincoln. And so we have heard, have we not, in the last year or two, everybody wants to get right with Lincoln. But which Lincoln are we getting right with? It's interesting that Joe Biden gave an address at Gettysburg as part of his campaign for the presidency. So I think that Lincoln, as I attempted to say in my conclusion, it's not that Lincoln can tell us what to do with climate change, but I think there's some lasting values here. It starts out with respect. It's hard to believe this, but Lincoln and Douglas, who in some ways were these arch foes, they sometimes slept in the same bed as they were traveling across Illinois. Douglas runs for the presidency in 1860 and loses to Lincoln. And when Lincoln comes to his inaugural address, Lincoln is kind of fumbling with his top hat and with his cane, and Douglas steps forward and says, "Sir," and he takes Lincoln's cane to hold it in deep respect for this man. So Lincoln offers this remarkable respect for the other side. We've lost that. We've lost that. I mean, I think of the fist bump of Liz Cheney, which has created such a backlash where she fist bumped President Biden. And I thought her answer was quite remarkable. She said, well, I disagree with President Biden on all kinds of things, but she said, we are all Americans. We are all Americans. And I think that kind of inclusivity is what makes Lincoln so marvelous. Last week I received my questionnaire. The C-SPAN does a presidential survey at the end of each new president. And I was privileged to participate in the 2017 Presidential Historian Survey. Lincoln was voted number one. And so now everybody's on the ballot, including Donald Trump. And so by June 1st, we have to turn in our ballot, and it's based on 10 different categories by which you would, administrative ability, persuasion, commitment to social justice, I'm quite confident that Lincoln will rise to the top. I thought Stephen Davis might have flagged this question for me, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to answer this. I don't really want to get into the conversation of taking down Lincoln statues or taking Lincoln's name off of schools. I believe that says more about us than it does about Lincoln. And I have to say, if I can say this here, I'm really distressed by our moral superiority in looking back on the 19th century or the 18th century. We are so morally superior to those people. We cannot seem to understand them in their own context and to treat them for who they are. We don't have to say yay or nay, we just have to understand them. So Bill, we'll have to continue the conversation in Maine when I see you in your home in Kennebunkport. Thank you.
Dr. White, a written request, Ron and Bonnie Blank send you their greetings from Ohio and can't wait to read the book. Their question relates to media coverage of Lincoln. Particularly, do you have a view about whether Lincoln would have been able to survive politically in today's media environment from both the right and the left?
Cynthia and I and Nancy actually have been in Dave and Bonnie's home at the Lakeview Chautauqua twice on Lake Erie. There's one of the three wonderful Chautauquas, actually four, that produces summer programming. Thank you, Dave, for that question. Yeah, the 24/7. I mean, Lincoln wants to take his time. For example, when the Dred Scott decision is coming forward to the Supreme Court, and we don't know it, he didn't know at that point what would the decision be. Everybody is rushing to speak. Lincoln doesn't speak. He takes 2.5 months to prepare himself. The Democratic newspaper in Springfield says he's walking across the street again to the library in Springfield to kind of take down the law books to see what's going on. So one of the reasons that he wrote these fragments was, in a sense, he wasn't ready to speak. He wanted to think this thing through. He wanted to prepare himself. And whether he could survive in this sort of thing, I want to... Lincoln won his way by his own integrity. He was asked to speak at Cooper Union in New York City in early 1860, and all the intelligentsia of New York was there. Was this country rube from Illinois? The Times of London called him the country lawyer after he wrote the Gettysburg Address. And Lincoln stands out on this stage and just overwhelms the intelligentsia of New York by his acumen, by taking on the questions that he knows are in their mind. So give him time, and he is a remarkable person. He could speak extemporaneously, but I'm arguing that the extemporaneity was always had a foundation of all the thinking that he had done, which is why I'm publishing this book. He was preparing himself to speak publicly. It's a fair question.
And one more written request from
Yes.
Subo. Did you learn anything new about Lincoln's view of the contributions of women to the governing of the nation?
I did not. Lincoln was a person of his time. One of the problems, there's a new book coming out on Mary Lincoln, and the original title was The Honest Mary and the Honest Lincoln and the Dishonest Mary. I do not like the going after Mary as this particular historian does. Mary had more education than he did. She was quite educated for a young girl in her time. She saw his ability to rise before he did. She was his champion in Springfield. She was his confidant. She was his advisor. She was a very smart person. When she gets to Washington, she is treated by the other women of Washington as a Western rube. Illinois was the frontier. They never gave her respect, and she was then, I'm not sure this was in any way intentional, she was in a sense marginalized as Lincoln's advisors became William Seward and members of his cabinet. And so the idea of the advancement of women, this was not part of Lincoln's purview in his time in the 19th century.
Hi, Ron. So I'm curious, given all of your research and study and everything you've done to really sort of understand President Lincoln, if you had an opportunity to have coffee with President Lincoln tomorrow morning, what mystery, what question, what unknown would you want to talk about, if you could only talk about one thing, and why?
My first off the top of the head question would be, why did you keep McClellan on so long as the general of the army? The second, longer question probably would be, could you tell us more? You tease us with the meditation on the divine will. You give us something in the second inaugural address, but where do you think you want to go with that going forward in the second administration? I have discovered that Muslims and Jews are very attracted to Lincoln. They find in the second inaugural a kind of inclusive breadth that they can enter into. Surely Lincoln was not confronting the kind of religious diversity that is part of our life today, but his speech, his whole spirit is open-ended, ready to learn, open and respectful to others. So I'd like to ask him more about that. Maybe we should quit while we're ahead. We'll do one more.
One more slipped in under the wire. Brian Marquez says, thank you, Ron, for inviting Sandy and me to join you tonight. I noticed that most of the attendees tonight have grayed a bit, as I have. Here we go.
Careful, this is my nephew.
Given the value of what you've presented tonight, how might we engage our children and grandchildren, the younger generation, in this type of conversation and encourage them to wrestle with these ideas that they may not now embrace?
Thank you, Byron, for that wonderful question. You know, in all the standardized testing, Lincoln is not a part of those tests. And I've been a part of doing events for teachers, grade school, middle school, high school, trying to offer Lincoln as something that teachers should spend more time on. Just as Byron, I think, is suggesting in his question that this is something that I think young people can get into. I mean, the boy Lincoln is a fascinating story for children. But what you're suggesting, Byron, is how can we engender in our children and grandchildren this kind of open-ended conversation where we listen. We don't have to say yay or nay, but we try to listen to what the other person says. I think Lincoln is a fantastic role model in this, perhaps the best role model, and we can claim him for that, and we should introduce our children to Lincoln. My greatest joy really is when a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old tells me, I'm reading your book on Lincoln. I was in the Abraham Lincoln bookstore in Springfield, and a group of girls came in from a private school. They all had on their same colored dresses. And this little girl, about 10, 11, 12 years of age, said, well, I want to buy Dr. White's book. It's $20. Oh, but he said there's tax. So it's $23.75 or something. Oh, she said, I only have $20. So I reached in my billfold. Here, I wanted that young girl to read this book. Thank you very much.
Ron, this has been absolutely delightful. Thank you for opening this book for all of us. Thank you for giving this opportunity to join you on this exciting journey, because your enthusiasm for this is absolutely contagious. Whether you are here in the room or whether you are online, I'm just going to invite you one more time to show your appreciation for Ron. The time has come for us to exit the building. I invite you to please remember to keep on your masks. I do believe, Ron, you're going to linger around just for a minute.
Sure.
So if you are in the room, you can linger too. Just remember, elbow bumps. We'll open the doors and keep everything safe. If you are online, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It has been really delightful to be able to see some of your faces and share in community across this expanse of a nation. It's one of the best benefits of this season is that we have learned how technology can draw us closer together rather than drive us apart. So thank you everybody here. Enjoy your evening, and Ron will be here to greet you and say goodbye.
Thank you.